All right, so now that we've gone over the provisions of the first New Deal, let's talk a little bit about opposition to the first New Deal. Because as anything that happens in politics, the New Deal does garner some opposition and, people who think they can do it better, people who don't like it at all. So let's talk a little bit about that. So, the Supreme Court in 1935 was still largely controlled by conservative Republicans, and they were still very much wedded to the 19th century conception of freedom, that is, liberty of contract, and began to invalidate New Deal laws as they came up in challenges to the courts. One of the first instances of this we have in 1935 is the invalidation of the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, in the Schechter Poultry case. The company was charged with violating the industry code that was set, and in a unanimous decision, the court declared the NRA unlawful because the codes and other regulations delegated legislative power to the president and attempted to regulate businesses that did not engage in interstate commerce. So that was the centerpiece of the first New Deal, struck down like that in a single case. The Agricultural Adjustment Act met a similar fate in the case of United States versus Butler in 1936. In this case, the court declared it an unconstitutional exercise of congressional power over local economic activities. So, having failed to end the Depression or win judicial approval, the first New Deal pretty much ground to a halt. But pressures were mounting from outside as well. And one of the places that we see this happening is with labor. The 1930s sees a reawakening of the labor movement. And this is predicated on a few preconditions. The first of these is that the federal government gives some encouraging signs of support for labor with the inclusion of Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which protected workers' rights to unionize. And unlike previously, the government largely seemed to be on the side of labor under FDR. We're also going to see the receding of ethnic differences. American-born children of immigrants were now the dominant force in the industrial sort of labor force, and organizers now no longer had to distribute materials in multiple languages. And so you get a lot more unity among the group in that case. You also get a new crop of sort of militant leadership, many of them socialists and communists that had weathered the repression of the 1920s are ready to come back with a vengeance. So, what do they want? Well, kind of what they've always wanted. Better wages, checks on the power of employers. Factories essentially ran like little mini dictatorships, where unions were rare, workers could be fired at will, management determined the length of the workday and the speed of the assembly line. And so they generally wanted labor rights, union recognition, and things like that. Things that they had always been asking for. 1934 sees a massive labor upheaval. Nationwide, we see a wave of strikes, no fewer than 2,000 strikes, many producing violent confrontations. A lot of these major strikes won at least some of the workers' demands. For example, in San Francisco, dock workers walked out. In Minneapolis, truck drivers. In Toledo, auto workers, all of them walking out of their factories with similar demands. And all of these were largely successful in achieving at least some of those demands. Now, we're also going to see a divide in labor organizations. Up to this point, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is the dominant force in the labor movement throughout the 1920s, but they'd kind of been tamed a little bit in the 1920s. And the upheaval of the 30s posed a very unique challenge. The AFL policy had traditionally been to organize workers by craft rather than by industry. But to counter this, in 1934, the AFL called for the creation of unions of industrial workers, but the convention held in 1935 ultimately rejected this. This resulted in wings of the AFL walking out, led by John Lewis, who was the head of the United Mine Workers. And this group created the Congress of Industrial Organizations, essentially a group of smaller industrial unions like the Miners Union or the Auto Workers Union or the Steel Workers Union, who would come together in a Congress to make joint decisions where workers were organized by industry. Their agenda was very similar. They wanted the organization of industrial factions, those industrial unions. They also wanted the somewhat more vague economic freedom and industrial democracy, things that included stuff like inevitably higher wages, a greater slice of the pie, if you like. The CIO were also responsible for introducing some landmark strikes, including the United Auto Workers sit-down strikes in Cleveland and Flint, Michigan. This tactic was not new. It had been pioneered roughly 3 decades earlier by the IWW, but it was a revolutionary tactic and far more effective than a walkout, because a sit-down strike, as is implied by the image here, is essentially where workers stop working, but they also occupy the factory. This meant that companies couldn't hire strike breakers, as the workers were actually occupying the plant. Now, these strikes featured a certain spirit of militancy, but also of unity. They would clean the plant, they oiled the idle machinery, and they settled disputes peacefully amongst themselves. Their wives would shuttle food back and forth out of the factory so that they wouldn't have to leave the plants. And ultimately, this resulted in a victory and union recognition by General Motors, which was the largest American auto manufacturer. A similar tactic also worked with U.S. Steel and among the steel union. However, smaller firms continued to resist unionization efforts of workers, including the Republic Steel Strike, which actually resulted in bloodshed with a confrontation between law enforcement and strikers. Overall, we see a huge progress of unionization and the labor movement. Union membership exploded, reaching roughly 9 million by 1940. And they actually start to achieve some goals. They achieve a sense of workplace power and dignity, including things like grievance procedures, seniority systems for hiring, firing, and promotions. Labor also has a growing impact on politics, with the upsurge altering the balance of economic power in the country. And they present a political vision that included an activist federal government. CIO put forth an ambitious program of federal action to shield Americans from economic and social insecurity, including things like public housing, universal health care, employment, and age insurance. Now, there are also other crusaders for economic justice. The first of these is Upton Sinclair with his In Poverty in California movement. He won the Democratic nomination for governor of California, and as part of his platform called for state use of idle factories and land and cooperative ventures to provide jobs for those who were unemployed. Now, Sinclair ultimately loses the election in California after being subjected to one of the first modern negative media campaigns by his opponent, where literally his opponent blatantly lies and creates false endorsements from like the Communist Party and stuff like that, which kills Sinclair's campaign. But Sinclair is not alone. Probably one of the most famous and one of the ones that presents an actual potential threat to Roosevelt in the election of 1936 is Huey Long with his Share Our Wealth movement. Now, Huey Long had been elected as the governor of Louisiana and was currently serving in the Senate after being elected there. And in 1934, he launched his Share Our Wealth movement, calling for the confiscation of most of the wealth of the richest Americans in order to finance immediate grants of $5,000 and a guaranteed job and annual income for all Americans. He was on the verge of announcing a run for president when he was assassinated. And up here in the corner is Huey Long, and that's actually an image of his funeral where literally thousands of people attended to show their or to pay their respects. Finally, you have Dr. Francis Townsend with his Townsend Clubs. He won support largely from older Americans for a plan through which the government would make monthly payments of around $200 to older Americans with the requirement that they spend that money immediately in order to boost the economy. Now, none of these movements ultimately pick up enough speed in order to really challenge Roosevelt. The only one that had a real chance was probably Long, but he was quite literally cut short in that case. But they do represent a change in the air, a sense of dissatisfaction that Americans are not pleased with the extent that the government has gone to so far, and in fact thinks the government needs to do more. And it's after 1934 and all of this upheaval that we're actually going to see Roosevelt move to the second phase of the New Deal, which is going to represent a lot more liberal, in the modern sense of the word, liberal movements and programs. And that's where we're going to go next.